12 people are walking around right now with a computer chip drilled into their skulls. Not in a laboratory, not sedated, living their lives, eating breakfast, watching television, thinking about what to do next, while 1,024 microscopic electrodes read the electrical signals firing inside their brains in real time. The company that put those chips there is Neuralink, founded by Elon Musk. The device is called the N1. And what it has already allowed those 12 people to do is not what most people imagine when they hear the phrase brain-computer interface. It is simultaneously more mundane and more profound than the science fiction version. Because the gap between what Neuralink has already demonstrated and what the human nervous system could theoretically allow is so large that the real story is not what is happening right now. It is the trajectory. That trajectory is what nobody is talking about clearly enough. The stakes here are not abstract. When Neuralink received FDA approval for human trials in May 2023, it crossed a threshold that had taken decades of failed attempts by other labs and companies to even approach. The first human implant happened in January 2024. Within weeks, that patient, a 29-year-old man named Nolan Arbaugh, paralyzed from the shoulders down following a diving accident, was playing chess in the video game Civilization on a laptop using nothing but his thoughts. No keyboard, no mouse, no hand movement of any kind. Just intention translated into cursor movement at speeds that exceeded what most paralyzed patients had ever achieved with any assistive technology. That alone is extraordinary. But here is what raises the stakes beyond one man and one chip. There are approximately 5.4 million people living with paralysis in the United States alone. Globally, spinal cord injuries affect roughly 250,000 to 500,000 new people every year, according to the World Health Organization. ALS, the neurodegenerative disease that progressively destroys the ability to speak, move, and eventually breathe, affects around 30,000 Americans at any given moment. For these populations, a device that can translate brain signals into digital commands is not a luxury technology or a transhumanist experiment. It is the difference between communicating with your family and disappearing into silence. The difference between operating a wheelchair independently and depending on another person for every movement of your day. The FDA's approval to expand Neuralink's trial to 12 implanted patients by mid-2026 represents a deliberate, methodical escalation, and for every person in that trial, the personal stakes could not be higher. But to understand why this moment is genuinely different from every brain-computer interface attempt before it, you need to understand how long people have been trying to do this and why they kept failing. The idea of reading the brain's electrical signals goes back to the 1920s, when a German psychiatrist named Hans Berger built a primitive device to detect the brain's electromagnetic activity from outside the skull, what we now call an electroencephalogram, or EEG. For most of the following century, brain-computer interface research was trapped by a fundamental problem. The skull is an extraordinarily bad conductor. Reading brain signals through bone and skin is like trying to hear a single violin in a stadium concert by pressing your ear against the outside wall of the building. You can detect that music is playing. You cannot distinguish the melody. Researchers eventually developed electrode arrays that could be placed directly on the brain's surface, bypassing the skull. But those devices were limited by scale. The Utah array, a standard research tool that looks like a tiny bed of nails and became the most widely used implanted electrode device in neuroscience, typically carries 96 electrodes. That sounds like a lot until you consider that the human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, with trillions of connections between them. Reading 96 signals from that system is like trying to understand a city by listening to 96 conversations happening simultaneously across 8 million people. You can extract some meaning, but you are missing almost everything. What Neuralink did was not invent a new idea. It industrialized the problem's solution. The N1 chip contains 1,024 electrodes, more than 10 times the density of the Utah array, distributed across 64 ultra-thin threads, each thread thinner than a human hair. And those threads are not inserted randomly. Neuralink built a custom surgical robot, called the R1, specifically to place each thread with sub-millimeter precision, avoiding blood vessels to reduce inflammation and scar tissue. The two main reasons previous electrode implants degraded and failed within months. The result is a device that reads more signals, more accurately, for longer periods than anything implanted in a human brain before it. When Nolan Arbaugh first used the N1 chip, he reported achieving cursor control within minutes of the system being calibrated to his neural patterns. He described it as feeling natural almost immediately. Within weeks, He was able to move a cursor on screen for over 8 hours in a single session. Previous electrode-based systems had achieved perhaps 2 hours before signal quality degraded. That endurance gap is not a small engineering footnote. It is the difference between a medical device and a practical daily tool. But the more surprising revelation, the one that genuinely changes how you should think about this technology, is not about speed or endurance. It is about what the brain does when you give it a new output channel. Here is what researchers did not fully anticipate going into Neuralink's human trials. The brain adapts to the chip. Not metaphorically, literally. The motor cortex, the region of the brain responsible for planning and executing movement, begins to reorganize around the new interface. Neurons that previously encoded physical hand movements start encoding cursor movements instead, even though no hand movement is occurring. The brain, in other words, begins to treat the chip as a limb. It incorporates the device into its own map of the body. Neuroscientists call this process cortical plasticity, and while it has been observed in animal studies for years, the speed at which it occurred in human N1 patients surprised even Neuralink's own researchers. One specific finding from the first cohort: within 60 days of implantation, the neural firing patterns associated with the imagined hand movements that initially controlled the cursor had changed. Patients were no longer imagining moving a hand. They were imagining moving a cursor directly. The abstraction had collapsed. The brain had rewired itself to think natively in the language of the machine. This has an implication that is hard to overstate. It means the ceiling on what a brain-chip interface can eventually do is not set by the technology. It is set by the brain's willingness to adopt new representations, and the evidence so far suggests that willingness is nearly unlimited. Neuralink's second trial patient, whose identity has not been publicly confirmed at the time of writing, reportedly demonstrated faster adaptation than Arbaugh, achieving reliable cursor control within days rather than weeks. The learning curve is already getting shorter. So how does the actual signal chain work, from thought to action? When you decide to move your hand, your motor cortex fires a cascade of electrochemical signals, neurons communicating through a combination of electrical spikes and chemical messengers at the synapse. The N1 chip's electrode threads sit close enough to individual neurons to detect those voltage spikes directly. Each spike is tiny, measured in microvolts, roughly 1,000,000 times smaller than the voltage of a single AA battery. The chip's onboard processor amplifies and digitizes those signals at a sampling rate of around 20 kHz, 20,000 measurements per second, then compresses and transmits the data wirelessly through the skull via Bluetooth to an external device. No wires exit the body. The entire system is powered by an inductive charging coil embedded beneath the skin, recharged wirelessly like a modern smartphone, typically while the patient sleeps. The external software then runs a decoding algorithm, a type of machine learning model that translates the incoming spike patterns into intended actions. Think of it like a language model that has been trained specifically on that patient's neural vocabulary. Early in calibration, the algorithm is essentially guessing, building its model from scratch. But as the patient uses the device, the model refines itself, and simultaneously, as we just discussed, the brain reshapes itself to meet the model halfway. It is a two-way learning process happening in parallel, the machine learning about the brain and the brain learning about the machine, converging toward fluency. Now for the part that deserves genuine scrutiny. The first thing to understand is that thread retraction is a real and documented problem. In Nolan Arbaugh's case, within weeks of his implant, a portion of the N1 chip's electrode threads retracted from the brain tissue, essentially pulled out of position as the brain moved slightly within the skull. This reduced the number of working electrodes from 1,024 to a smaller functional subset, and with it, the signal quality and cursor control performance dropped measurably. Neuralink addressed this through software recalibration and claims to have improved the thread attachment design for subsequent patients. But it demonstrates that the long-term mechanical stability of threads finer than a human hair inside a living brain that shifts with every heartbeat and every breath is an unsolved engineering challenge, not a finished one. The second concern is harder to engineer away. It is the data. The N1 chip is recording the raw electrical output of a human brain, not search history, not location data. Neural firing patterns that, with sufficient decoding sophistication, could eventually reveal not just intended movements, but mental states, emotional responses, and potentially, as the technology matures, fragments of internal thought. Neuralink is a private company. Its data governance policies are not subject to the same transparency requirements as a hospital or a pharmaceutical company. No comprehensive federal framework currently governs what a brain-computer interface company can do with the neural data it collects, stores, or theoretically sells. The FDA regulates the device's safety. Nobody regulates the information it produces. This is not a hypothetical worry about a distant future. It is a structural gap that exists right now, while 12 people are already implanted. Here is how this affects you directly, even if you will never be near a Neuralink device. The 12 patients currently implanted are all people with severe neurological conditions, paralysis, ALS, or similar diagnoses. That is phase 1. Neuralink has been explicit, and Elon Musk has been even more explicit, that the long-term vision is not limited to medical use. The roadmap leads toward healthy individuals voluntarily upgrading their cognitive interface. The company calls this version telepathy, and the pitch is simple. In a world where every information worker competes with AI systems that process data thousands of times faster than a human can type or speak, a direct neural interface removes the bottleneck between your thoughts and the digital world. If that sounds far off, consider that the gap between a 96 electrode research device and a 1024 electrode commercial chip took roughly 15 years to cross. The next 15 years will likely produce devices with electrode counts in the tens of thousands. If you work in any field where the speed of human-computer interaction is a competitive constraint, software development, financial trading, medical diagnosis, creative production, you are watching the early stages of a change that could restructure who is productive and who is not. Not in 50 years. The FDA's expanded approval timeline suggests commercially available medical devices within 5 to 8 years, with elective consumer versions a plausible, if contested, follow-on. What you should watch for is not the next Neuralink press release. It is the FDA's response to Neuralink's long-term safety data from this current cohort, expected to begin emerging publicly in 2027. Zoom out far enough, and what Neuralink represents is not primarily a technology story. It is a story about a species beginning to blur the boundary between its biology and its